facilitator here. I want to start by just clarifying the roles of the folks around the table that are going to help, and then we'll start doing an overview of these actions, and we'll have a discussion. We probably have about an hour. We'll get a 10-minute warning from Jim, so that will help us move along. So, yeah, my job is to facilitate the discussion and help us get to those decisions and forward steps around what's included, what's not, what needs to evolve, what is more need to be added, what more clarification needs, and the same questions that you talked about in the first session this morning. Penny is the co-chair of the working group and is an expert on this, and her job is to bring the working group's deliberations and thoughts into your task force discussion here in the small group. So she's presenting, as we talk about some of the recommendations, the supporting and dissenting opinions that came out of that work group. So she's not speaking as Betty, she's not bringing any agenda in or otherwise into this. She's basically representing the expertise of the group in the discussion. In addition, we have Guy Norman from the Northwest Power Planning Council, a governor appointee who knows a lot about issues with dams and fish and getting to learn about the power side, so he's going to speak to some of that when we have those questions. And Michael Schmidt knows a great deal about the research and science around salmon and prey issues in Puget Sound. So that's our brain trust to help this discussion happen. Questions? And Kathy, again, most important person, she's taking the notes, and we'll be putting up on these flip charts the discussions and the thoughts you have and the questions that you have this. So this is what we had from before. We're really not going to go through what those comments are. We're really going to get your comments and thoughts about the recommendations. So, again, as before, this is a subset of recommendations around predation, and it's the ones that had the most amount of disparate viewpoints about what should happen going forward and things that need to be clarified and further refined, and again, decisions made about conclusion.
And for clarity, this is only birds and pinheads. We pulled the fish predation ones out for now, and we'll talk about those in a different conversation.
That and hatchery and habitat, all the other things with prey are, as we talked about this morning, are going to be processed forward because they already got support, and we'll have a big chance to refine those in the next go around. So this is where we need you to dig in and help us think things through. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 recommendations in here, and I'm just going to give a very quick overview, and then we'll go into the discussion. The first one is a science-related one. This one is actually not one that was sort of as much controversial as it is something that the working group said is really the precursor, the gateway to doing anything on predation is to have some of the basis of the science that enables us to move forward, both from the standpoint of what's going to work and what's not, and from the standpoint of what's going to be passing legal muster. Yeah. Okay. Hello?
Is this how killer whales feel?
Yeah. Folks in the room here, may I have your attention, please? This is our working session now, so we need everyone to quiet down so we can have a discussion here to go listen in to whatever session you want to participate in terms of listening, or to go out in the hallway to continue your conversations. Thank you, thank you. We got people who want to listen and people who want to hear. Appreciate that. Yeah, look at the hands going up. Fred Feldman, that includes you. All right. So first one is about science, and a thought about that is that it's a gateway, it's a stage to let anything else happen. You guys want me to keep using this? The next
The next two, one is borrowed from the hydro group, increased survival in predation hotspots associated with dams. And then there's a strong link between that and predation B2, lethal removal of birds to benefit specific runs and stocks. So the thought of the working group is that actually most of the things that you would do, if not all of them, that are in B2 are actually already included as part of C, Hydro C. So we can discuss that and whether there are other things that we need to be done and whether those should be combined or not as a recommendation. The next two, Predation A1 and Predation B1, are about focused on thinking about where you go to deal with predators at specific locations, so pinch points. The first one is about removing the artificial habitat that enables those predators to be there, discourages them from being there. The second one is about lethal removal at those sites. So we can talk a little bit about those together, but they're obviously very different, and we want to make sure we talk about B1 because that's one of the more significant and potentially controversial ones. And then the last one is one that actually was not highly supported by the task force in the survey, but several task force members asked that it be brought back for consideration, and that's about actually lethal removal to set a target for predators in an entire region, and then harvesting those pinnipeds to get to that target. So that's got more consequences to it and more challenges to it, but we want to have a conversation to see if you what you thought about whether that should stay or go in this group. Just a context, and then we'll start, is that think about the science, and then another way to reorganize or think about these particular recommendations is what's going on in the Columbia River with pinnipeds and birds, and there's definitely recommendations in here that address both. And then what's going on in Puget Sound and the outer coast with pinnipeds. Birds hasn't really been part of the discussion here, but it could be. But we really have two different physical areas and two different sets of things going on, two different levels of science that already supports actions that are going on. So another way that the work group may come back and say these could be combined is to say very specifically what do we do here across these actions in Columbia River, and what do we do Puget Sound and outer coast. Administrative, legal, who does what's the level of effort. So that's our context here for our discussion. Any questions or comments or thoughts, clarification? Eddie, you want to add any?
No, just as a structure for the conversation, we'll go through the discussion guide and the options from the working group that are in the blue boxes are the specifics that came from them that fall underneath each one of those actions. And some of them, as Mark said, will be specific to a geographic area, and some of them will be more overarching, could be done anywhere. So we can walk through those as we go.
Great. So first one around science, continue the development of additional science to better understand pinnipeds, predation on salmonoids, especially Chinook. So again, that's the broader base sort of strategy. Underneath that is suggestions from the working group, fund monitoring associated with Bonneville, and then continue to develop better science about what's going on in Puget Sound and the outer coast.
Guy, do you want to give some
Michael and
context
Guy
about
could,
the first
yeah.
one real quick, because you didn't in the last one?
Yeah, so
regarding the Columbia River and the pinniped impacts on listed salmon in the Columbia River and hatchery salmon as well. The research that was conducted for several years back in the early 2000s is really the information that resulted in the current authorization to manage sea lion predation. Ongoing research is important and was critical for the receptiveness of Congress on the current legislation regarding the ability to further manage sea lions on the Columbia River and the predation on salmon. And also, it's also important for that to continue to provide managers the opportunity to present the case that it's a critical piece of salmon recovery and rebuilding salmon populations in the Columbia River, given the impact is in the range of up to 40% and averaging 20 to 30% with the no research ongoing. So that's of the adult return populations of spring Chinook.
Great. Michael, do you just want to talk for a second about the sound? Sure.
So most of the discussion in Puget Sound is in reference to harbor seals, and my context is that I'm the U.S. program manager for the Sailor Sea Marine Survival Project, which is a big effort with the U.S. and Canada to try to understand what's affecting the survival of juvenile Chinook, coho, and steelhead. Harbor seals is one of the potential factors that we're looking at, and there's been work within our group and then outside of our group that's been going on. And just to give you some context, the paper that drove a lot of the recent discussions around harbor seal predation was released by NOAA. It was Brandon Chasko, and it suggested a predation level of about 25% of all of the out-migrating juveniles are being consumed as they move through Puget Sound. That estimate was based on an estimate of what the harbor seal population was here, using some data that was a little older, and then also some diet data that was from kind of central the Sailor Sea. It was the Cowichan, which is South Strait, Georgia. But that diet data was not considered very far off from what we had known historically about what's going on in Puget Sound. Fast forward to that was like data from basically 2012, 2013. Since then, more information is being collected, and more information has been collected in Puget Sound as well. So now the emphasis locally is on bringing that information into the discussion so we can have a more holistic idea of what's going on in Puget Sound, and understand both if there's variability in space and in time and why, and that will help inform management action. So this is essentially providing that space to get the work done, and then also keep going on things that you need to know to inform management actions, like where do we see predation most, and what all the factors that may be affecting it. Thank you.
Yeah, Penny?
So one thing that came up in the last group, and I think it helps to clarify the difference between A and B, is, as Guy mentioned, A is a predation management program that is already existing, and this science would be used to better inform that and to continue as we go forward to review and potential increase in management in that area. As opposed to B is we're in a place where we don't currently have a pinniped management program already ongoing, and that authorization hasn't occurred. And so the science that is in B is something that would be needed with that specificity that Michael outlined in order to put any sort of management program underway and to get authorization through the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So that's the difference between A and B. One is to support an already existing action, and another is for understanding better and to look at potential future management options.
Great.
So thoughts from task force members on this? Overall, and A and B as a part of the 2018 package, is what are people's thoughts on that as a way to go? James?
I just wanted to, it's almost a question, but is A needed if it's already happening? I mean, I kind of equate it to the vessel group saying ferries should continue to slow down when they see whales. Well, they've been slowing down for years. It's policy. Is this, I guess, is this funding in danger of not going on?
Would it not happen
If we didn't
ask for
have
that? Guy, do you know?
Right?
So I think there's probably, the answer is twofold. One is there is a funding linkage that is related to monitoring the problem and displaying that there's a need to continue the management. And then in terms of the authorization, current and future, the current authorization is very limited. Bonneville Dam alone. There's legislation that was passed by the House and passed through committee in the Senate, hasn't been before the full Senate as of yet, that would expand the management area and the management level for state and tribal managers to manage the sea lion impact on salmon. In order to I guess, push forward on those bills, it was real critical to have the impact level that's been in a research project by NOAA, where I mentioned earlier up to 43%. In the largest year, but substantial every year. But that was a key piece of information. If that legislation passed, or quite frankly, also with the current authorization, there's 5-year reviews to determine whether or not the management should continue. And so it's key to have that information of how the impact level is changing over time once the management efforts are put in place.
And so there's no funding currently to continue doing that, or there is? Or?
So NOAA's been funding the current limited effort. There's not funding that's identified specifically for an expanded effort. So the information is key to also to be able to solicit additional funds.
This would be continuing and expanding that effort under A, and as a recommendation of the task force, which is a broad-based set of people to the process.
Right, so the continued research is kind of critical for the continued authorization, but also certainly for the expanded management if indeed the legislation fully passes.
So I think your answer is it's needed, yeah, it helps moving forward. Other thoughts from people?
Yeah.
David, go front.
There's one right here that I'm just looking at, Senate Bill 3119, Endangered Salmon Predation Prevention Act, and I'm sure this has to do with the Columbia because it's Senator James from Idaho. But it talks about how to be able to amend the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 72 to authorize the NOAA to issue 1-year permits, allowing Washington, Oregon, Idaho, the Nez Perce tribe, and quite a few tribes on here, to kill sea lions in a portion of the Cowlitz, the Columbia River, and certain tributaries in order to protect fish from the sea lion predation. Permits may be issued to kill sea lions only if sea lions are part of the population that is not depleted. So there's something right there, but I think as far as where we are, Johnstone Strait has over 40,000 harbor seals. We have probably over 25,000 here in Puget Sound. And even though there was a study that WDFW just did, said that salmon is a very small portion of harbor seal's diet, it's the sheer amount. I've been reading about Johnstone Strait for 4 or 5 years and watching their populations crash. And it's just the abundance. It's like locusts, you know, a small amount in the field isn't going to do much damage, but when you do a swarm, it can take them out. And I'm afraid we're going to take our eye off this and we're going to fail as a task force if we don't keep this up in front. We need the hatchery production because the seals are starving. You can't dispute that. And then we got to follow up, make sure that we get something in place to start managing the canopids and birds, but it does need to be done.
So you're a yes for that science
But
work?
you're skipping ahead though.
Yeah.
So the bill is in B1, so we'll get there.
Yeah, B1 option C is, and a couple of elements in there are a direct link to that bill.
I think
Okay.
go ahead.
Oh,
Yeah. We've got Mindy and is next, but yeah.
Yeah, so I was confused. I wanted to make sure we're talking about B4, and the answer is yes. And so the science that is needed here in the Columbia River system and then also in Puget Sound and the Outer Coast, this is information, at least for Puget Sound, that I hear you say there's maybe 25,000 seals, but that tells me we really don't know. So this is an information gap that the science people are saying needs to be filled. Is that correct?
It's an information.
Yeah,
Okay.
and you'll see another more specific potential recommendation that the working group put forward that includes an assessment by NOAA, and they need an assessment by NOAA with review by their scientific group that would establish the optimum sustainable population, and then thereby essentially let everyone know based upon the stocks that are existing in for example, Puget Sound, there are several different harbor seal stocks. What would be the allowable take under MMPA for each one of those stocks? So
But
that's
before
the process
doesn't say that that's
No.
what we're going to, but there's a general information gap.
I'd say it's
It
both.
sounds like Michael is saying that it doesn't exist right now, or there's anecdotal information but not been compiled in a complete
No, I'm
scientific
saying
way.
that what B4 supports is the process that's already underway, but gets the funding in place to get what we're doing, which is adding more diet data, adding the monitoring that we need to occur to ensure that you have the right population census, and understanding where hotspots may be for predation. I think that's the right.
Yeah.
Again-
And the survey, the population numbers is just a part of that assessment that Michael's talking about.
George,
Yeah, so my question would be, how inadequate, I guess, Michael or Jacques, is the science that we have right now? The two papers that have been talked about the most, and Chesco, and Nelson. I mean, is it wildly wrong? I mean, is the order wrong? I mean, you've got the pinnipeds doing 8.5 million smolts, 150,000 adult fish. You got the southern residents at 83,000. You got the combined tribal, recreational, commercial harvest at 30. I mean, they all kind of say the same thing. If we support this, are we sort of saying that all that stuff is inadequate?
I guess I would suggest that it might not be precise enough for you to take lethal action on seals. So is it right enough to suggest that this is a high priority? Yeah. Is it right enough for you to take action on them?
Okay, so not enough to take lethal action.
No.
Okay.
And not enough to actually really contextualize it as well. It's not just about lethal action. There's other things that can be done. We have forage fish effects. We have effects of hatchery management potentially. You have effects of infrastructure. Counting on your hand, John, am I missing it?
And I think the other part of that, George, is that it's not necessarily whether it's right or wrong, but there are some of these pieces of that study that would be needed to get authorization to do those actions anyway, and so it's a necessary part of the process.
Yeah, so it's not just a gap, as you put it, but if you want to do anything else, you need to do the more specific, deeper studies to be able to get through the process of
Yeah, so as written, I generally support B4, both A and B, and I do not think that they preclude, clearly A does not preclude removal actions or management actions because that's currently being considered and authorized in Congress. B, as I understand it, would be necessary in order for us to move forward with similar actions in Puget Sound and on the outer coast. In addition to, so Michael suggested that there are, in addition to lethal removal, there are some other strategies that we could use to control seal populations or reduce their impact on our Chinook that both support fisheries and southern and killer whales. And he mentioned three of them. I guess the fourth one, which is embedded in here but hasn't really been stated, is we do not have solid year-to-year population counts on harbor seals. So we don't know what the immediate trend is in that population, and there seems to be some anecdotal information at the very least that predation on harbor seals in the Salish Sea has increased and is increasing. And so I think, again, before we would go to lethal management actions, we would want to have a very, very clear understanding of what the current sort of natural change in population is, because I think the change in population is significant. But is it so significant that we don't need to take action, or do we still need to take action? And then I think the second thing, and maybe this is going to come up later, would be authorizing the ability to do control actions in a pilot way, but I think that's relevant for a later
your recommendation. That's a good segue. I want to keep us moving here. I'm hearing a lot of good clarification and understanding of this, but understanding that it makes sense to do and some specific things about what we want to be looking at here. So I suggest we go from this one to the next one. So it fills gaps, and it's a precursor to being able to actually do some of the more significant actions on the next page.
Yeah, I think, real quick, I just want to make a point that I think tribal harvest would be one way to look at this, because we have some tribe members that could do it in the right sort of ethical way, but I'll just sort of, I think we need to add to the research and maybe change to apply the last line on that thing, to apply potential appropriate management action. Just so it doesn't look like the research is definitely, it's a little bit inappropriate to just suggest that the unknown stuff is going to go to some kind of management thing. I guess the issue I'll bring up is way back when I was last fishing game in the 70s, when salmon dropped down up there, they started paying 25 cents for people that killed Dolly Vardens. And that went on for a while, and then all of a sudden Dolly Vardens are a huge recreational fishery, and they also at the same time are bombing beluga whales in Cook Inlet, because they eat salmon. And there's some issues about human management, where it's just a little bit of a slippery slope that I think people should think about. But I like the research and figure out what's the right thing to do.
Understand that. Great. All right, let's look at Hydro C, and I asked you to look at both Hydro C in conjunction with B2, as we talked about. So Hydro C it's moved over because the predation's in it from the dam discussion, the hydro discussion, ours. There are 5 options within that the working group has put forward that are specific to achieving the survival of prey at those hotspots. Changing the discharge release sites for juvenile salmonids so they're not as concentrated and have a greater chance for survival. Support existing cormorant management plan objectives, which includes some artificial action removal, I think, as well as some amount of lethal removal. So that is in there. Appropriations to create cormorant habitat elsewhere, so that you would disperse the population outside of the places where it's concentrated. An action that's a little bit more general around relocating Caspian terns, again, to their sites where they have been before. And the last one, support non-lethal dissuasion to reduce bird predation near dams, which maybe, Penny, you want to say what that means?
Yeah, so I think D is in relation to, this has been done before, the historical distribution of Caspian terns, I think to our knowledge, has been more inland over time, and as we've created more coastal Caspian tern populations through things like having dredge spoils available for nesting habitat where there's plentiful food. So this is trying to reverse that trend, essentially, and so you'll hear of some things like in eastern Oregon or in eastern Washington where they've tried to have more potential breeding habitat for those bird species to dissuade them from the places that people don't want them because of predation concerns on easily listed stocks, and try to get them to go to inland areas where they might cause less damage on those stocks.
So, question for discussion is, the overall option makes sense to proceed with in the 2018 package? What's the level of support or questions about the specific elements underneath here, A to E? In the other group, there was a variety of comments about that. And are there anything else that should be included here? And then we'll connect that up to B2.
And so the one thing, Mark, was on B2, the reason that it says there aren't any specific options under here is because the working group, all of the things they came up with that were related to bird management happened to fall and be somehow related to the Hydro C action. So if there are other actions under Hydro B2 that you want us to consider, let us know and we'll keep that one. Otherwise, it kind of makes sense to fold those things together. Go.
Right. Donna?
I guess I need to fess up and say I have trouble with this whole approach and this whole argument. I haven't been persuaded that removing seals is going to work, or birds. It's my understanding that it works in very limited situations when there are specific individuals at specific locations that won't be replaced by other seals or sea lions following right behind them. So has this ever worked? what scale would we have to remove seals and sea lions to make a real difference for the orcas? I'm terrifically troubled that as humans we create these artificial situations and then we take it out on the animals who just innocently exploit it. And so I'm not confident this is going to result in actual changes for the orcas soon enough to make a difference for them. And I caution everyone that it wasn't that long ago people were shooting orcas because they saw them as competition for salmon. Also, in the 60s and 70s, when NOAA Fisheries issued permits to capture the salmon residents, it was based on population estimates that were wildly off. They thought there were 30,000 orcas in the Pacific Northwest, and in fact there were 300. And it's that reason the whales are endangered today. So when we start pulling on the threads of the whole ecosystem, we have to be very careful. We are not good at it.
Other thoughts?
Does Guy want to say something before I do, because I have thought.
That guy.
So I guess
It just takes a second once you turn it on.
hello.
Can't see without the glasses. So just in response to the sea lion, the current actions and the proposed actions in the new legislation are very prescriptive. So in the Columbia River, the mouth of the river, the California sea lions that are entering the river have expanded from a few hundred to about 3,000. But of those, there's just a few hundred that are targeting in areas like Willamette Falls and below Bonneville Dam and in key tributaries. So there's limitations associated with the authorization that are really targeting those areas that have expanded impact on salmon. And there are studies that show that at the mouth of the river, the percentage of the diet of the sea lions is a very small proportion of salmon. As you move up the river, it becomes almost 100% salmon populations and endangered populations. So there's science behind trying to target, limit the amount of sea lions that are actually removed to those areas where the impact is the highest, and the science supports that given the diet studies and where the fish are going, the salmon are going. So it's a limited effort, and it's a few hundred sea lions that are doing the major damage.
But how soon would those 100 be replaced? I mean, once you remove those 100, is this an ongoing removal program? So how many are taken?
So, and that's a good question too, I think. But I think when you look back historically, very few sea lions moved up past the estuary. Just a handful, less than 10 is what the information shows with observations before the year 2000, and it increased to a few hundred. So it's not a natural, historical migration feeding pattern. And so many of the scientists believe that it's learned behavior. And so as one particular sea lion moves and discovers and repeats, that it actually brings others with it. And so the idea would be, or the thought is, the theory, that as those targeted animals are removed, the recruitment will also lessen. And so over time, state and tribes would have to remove much less on a given year, and perhaps even end the program or substantially reduce it over time.
So one perspective that the whole thing is maybe the wrong way to go, but I want to hear from other task force members and a sense of how you do this in a really prescriptive, targeted way to address.
Yeah, so I'm sure I'm sensing that there's a lot of societal angst around this issue. So I just want to try to report as quickly as I can what our understanding is with respect to the Salish Sea. And so as Michael mentioned, he's the U.S. lead for an international 60-partner study of the Salish Sea ecosystem and poor marine survival of steelhead, coho, and chinook. And what we understand is that since about 1984 to 1990, Marine survival of steelhead in the region has gone down by 90%. Marine survival of coho has gone down by 75%. Marine survival of Chinook has gone down by a smaller margin, but it has gone down, particularly in the Strait of Georgia. And so we launched an effort with a lot of people and a large investment over 5 years to understand, is this because they don't have enough to eat? Is this because of some external mortality like contaminants or predation or disease? Or is there some ecosystem effect that's piling up on all of them? For steelhead, it's pretty clear that the loss has been heavily affected by predation by harbor seals. The evidence is pretty unambiguous. And so one of the things that we might say is that we can either have abundant steelhead populations returning to our rivers, whether they're from hatcheries or from wild populations, or we can have very robust seal populations. That we may, and there may be some mitigating factors like the Hood Canal Bridge. For Chinook, it looks like the seals are probably also a problem, but we do not know as clearly as we do for seals. So I would say to you that under our current management regime, which is the Marine Mammal Protection Act, we may be forced to make a choice between abundant Chinook populations, fisheries and southern roseate killer whales, or a very large population of harbor seals in Puget Sound. And I can't tell you that that's the case, but I think that that may be something that we're going to have to all live with. Now, we may also be running an experiment here where harbor seal populations are at the highest level that they've been in human occupation history of this region, because harbor seals used to be preyed upon by bears, coyotes, wolves, and people, and transient killer whales. But we really only have one population that's having any significant impact on them right now, and that's transient killer whales. So getting a handle on that is critically important. But we may, in order to be successful in our work that we're talking about here, have to address this issue. And I'm not prescribing how we do that. There are a number of methods. One of them Michael talked about, or some of them Michael's talked about and other people talked about. But I think that if we all ignore this issue and pretend that we can't address this issue, then we may be making a choice as a society that we prefer to have large populations of pinnipeds and small populations, in fact, maybe dwindling populations of southern resident killer whales, and unrepresented or inadequate meeting of our agreements for tribal treaty rights. And I'm just laying this out there as what I perceive as the facts that have been uncovered over a very significant investment of time. And I think it's society's job to make decisions about how we handle that. Thank you.
So we're really talking about the whole topic of predation as opposed to the specific recommendations here. Mindy, you had your hand up. We have about 10 minutes left here, so I want to make sure we get to particularly
we gotta move on.
B2 because it's very consistent with this discussion. Yeah.
And I do feel like we've been having two completely separate conversations in this room. One at the 30,000 feet, whether you're going to cull seals or not, and then another one trying to work through the potential recommendations. Yeah. So the way that Hydro C is worded right now, to me, was way too generic to support predation hotspots. I would need to know a lot more about that. But then as I look through A through E, they are weirdly specific. And somebody's got it in for cormorants, Caspian terns, East Island, whatever. So I'm a little worried here. I feel like our conversation today is all over the place. This one seems all over the place as well. So for us to be able to support it, I think we need a lot more information about what does control and predation hotspots look like, and then why were these particular bird actions, which all seem to be aimed at the Columbia system, nested under this as well. So I'm just not seeing the thread that ties all of these together.
So,
and you want to respond to that, and then we'll move us down.
Yeah. So the working group, when they were asked to come up with more specific recommendations, the ones that came up when they were thinking about bird lethal removal or non-lethal removal, all are things that are currently underway. So these are examples of things that are currently underway, already approved through the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and have gone through the EIS process and all of that. So these aren't new things. These are things that are ongoing. So those are the things they put out as, potentially support those things. Those would be the actions. That's why they got so specific as far as that goes. And the reason that they're all under Hydro C is that in one way, shape, or form, they all thought that they had some sort of nexus with the hydro system and in that area, why predation is such a problem.
So, in the interest of moving forward, if I could ask, if, we're going to characterize where every group comes out of this when we report out and then lead that towards our consensus. We're not, so how many people sort of feel like moving forward with this Hydro C option makes sense with some of the elements with further refinement? Just thumbs up. How many people thumbs sideways? No thumbs down.
Are there particular pieces of the specific actions that make you most uncomfortable? That would also be good information.
Yeah.
Well, given what you just said, I'm going to go back to our first topic. It makes me uncomfortable. I thought the purpose of this task force was to change the way we're doing things or come up with new ideas to do things. If these things are all, I mean, we're not saying that what's going on now is awful. We're saying that the situation's awful, but our actions we're trying to do, especially with acquisition and protection. So if these, I'm kind of like Mindy, they don't really tie together, but A through E, if they're already going on, and we have, as we talked this morning, a limited amount of things to put forward that will actually get acted on, why are we, I'm not disputing the value of this, I'm just saying if it's already going on, why are we considering it as part of this task force?
Yeah, understood.
Good. So point, maybe it doesn't raise the threshold, and there are certainly mixed feelings about this. So if I could say let's move to A1 and B1 with particular focus on B1. So this is about removal. A1 is about removal of artificial habitats and structures and elements for pinnipeds in the very specific locations, most important places where that could make a difference. Some general questions about the effectiveness, very specific actions that could be pursued there with the emphasis on doing pilots. B1 is about lethal removal, again, in very specific places. If it's supported by the science and the options there include supporting existing efforts around revisions to the MMPA, and 3119 comes in here, supporting B is around, what's the difference between A and B?
So the difference between A and B on B1 is one would be something like the task force would say, we want to support the bills that are currently in Congress. And B would be the task force would say, we support those bills in Congress and we want to fund the predation management up to 95% of removal of the pinnipeds present. So essentially, it gets to what you said, Donna, the idea I heard behind that second one that would be funding the project to carry out those actions is the idea is that you would want to eliminate the animals that have learned that behavior so that so that ideally you would get to a place you would not have to continue removing that number of pinnipeds. Is that right?
And then C is looking at the Puget Sound and ocean habitat, right, and going back to the science, getting information that would enable similar sets of actions to be taken before they are taken. Thoughts on this?
Is there a sheet that you can flip up?
Oh, yeah.
It's on a sheet.
All right.
I have a question. Go for it. So I'm concerned about the kind of myopic focus on the salmon that comes from the Columbia River. The orcas eat salmon that comes from the Fraser River, the Sacramento River, the Klamath River, and the whole of Puget Sound. So are we preparing to kill seals and sea lions at all of those places? If not, why not? And if this is the right way to go, I just don't this is such a tiny little drop in the bucket of this story, and I don't understand why. So explain to me, for those of you who are for this, why the focus on these locations? And why aren't you looking, if this is an actual solution, then do we have to do that at the Fraser River too, and the other places where the salmon-bearing streams that feed the orcas?
Well, for one, the pressure doesn't count, but it migration that causes these bottlenecks. We have these problems like we do in the Columbia River.
So where the salmon are schooling because of the dams, that's
Yes.
the issue?
Yeah, that is one of the conditions.
So we've created an artificial situation that's created the schooling?
Yes. You see problems with
But what about the harbor seal question in Puget Sound? There are harbor seals in all these other areas.
The harbor seal question in Puget Sound is probably more significant for juvenile out-migrating salmonids than it is for adults returning.
And that this does address the Puget Sound element of that. So I can see they're beginning to have people's, we're getting a hook here.
My understanding is it's the Columbia River that has seen the largest just decrease from historical abundance, different than the Fraser, different than Puget Sound. And since the whales have been, 6 to 8 months offshore, the Columbia fish are vitally important to the whales. So that's why I see this as being important.
As are the Klamath and the Sacramento. They're also intercepting those runs.
Yeah, I guess
And those two have been down.
I would just support that, yes, the Columbia is important, just as the Fraser is important, and the Puget Sound is important. So as for what went to the working group of asking specific recommendations, we didn't ask for specific geographics. We're thinking about prey is important from all of those places. These are the ones that they came up with as, we think that there are potential actions that could be done in these places. And the Columbia filtered to the top, and you'll see we're just in a different place than some of the Puget Sound recommendations, but they're trying to be holistic within Washington.
So let's hear from Guy, and then I want to hear from other task force members about this.
So maybe just a real quick response. I think they're all important. I think that what kind of makes the Columbia stand out is the data that's been collected over the last 15 years that shows that the impact has grown from minor to very significant, and it's on the rise.
So should we just see what they think about the haul out one and try to work through these so that we can get their indications? So on A1 is the haul out one that Mark spoke about earlier. And this is one that the working group said, we don't know what would happen if we did this. We don't know how effective it would be. We don't know where the pinniped would go. It would make most sense if it was done in a pilot manner with money for funding of monitoring so that we could learn from that and then work from there and do management that way. So that's what's expressed in A. And then they had other ideas to fund the removal of either any individual could try to make their area less attractive for haul-outs, or to integrate best management practices into guidelines. So it could be either a funding agency or a permitting agency could use those best management practices to eliminate haul-outs. How do y'all feel about it?
Thoughts on this one? I saw it shaking its head. I mean, nodding in a good way.
I was thinking this was a really good example where when we say we don't know what happens when these basic things have been tried in the past, this is exactly why we need the pilot studies to figure this out. We need to do it in a very objective way, and it needs to be, we need to learn from these. And frankly, if we lack fundamental information like, well, we don't know what would happen if we did this here, are we really in a position to start calling large numbers of animals? So I would suggest that a lot of the predation pieces that are needed are truly information and behavior based. I also feel like we need to be aware that the whack-a-mole approach that has been attempted a few times, clearly that has not worked, but I do feel like we need to put our scientists to work and have them design some programs to really test these on a larger scale. And I know a lot of people have said, well, we've tried all of the harassment techniques possible and none of them have worked. I've not seen a really good, strong scientific paper that's described, kind of an objective study like that. So I'd like to see us a little bit more in the information gathering, because if we don't know these basic pieces, how can we understand what the impact of larger scale culling has on the larger ecosystem?
Other thoughts? Lisa? Amy?
Well, we have to come up with all of the stuff immediately, so how much really time are we going to have for these pilot projects to, and at what point do we say, are they working or are they not? That's my concern.
So pilot's okay, but don't spend too much time on it. We need to keep it. Yeah. Dave?
So when I read this whole topic, it was clear to me that there's a lot of information about Columbia that's known, programs in place there, so that's was pretty well described. It was also clear to me that there isn't much data on the Puget Sound. Clearly, in our tribal fisheries, we see the predation from seals on the catch of our fishermen, so we know that's an issue. That oftentimes it's hard for our fishermen to keep ahead of the seals, so they're not just pulling in heads or half a fish. And the seals tend to go after the biggest and brightest fish in the net, and they rip the bellies open and eat the eggs and leave the fishermen with unmarketable fish, so we know they eat saline. But I thought, and I think we need to do further research to determine how much of an issue it is. I've seen different opinions, and that should start right away. I think today there was some discussion about research. I think we need to identify what sets up research overall we're going to try to implement right away, and I think this needs to be one of them in Puget Sound, so decide how we really want to be able to deal
So
with
back
this.
to the first recommendation, science and research to expedite.
Yeah, and just for clarity, I don't know if we said this in that group, but that analysis that Michael was talking about for Puget Sound and the Outer Coast is going on right now. Like we're working our scientists to try to pull information together as quickly as possible, including, I think, very soon reaching out to a lot of tribal biologists asking for their input as well, because we're going to need to put it all together and really. So anything that
It needs fun.
And it needs fun.
I think this is at least in Puget Sound, in the some of the specific instances that I understand, we should try this. We should try this, and we should see if it's helpful, and set up some controls where we might have other structures that we don't take out, and see if it makes a difference. Because we're suspicious that this is an issue, at least in some particular places, and it might be a big issue.
Ron?
Just, I want to clarify one thing. You're probably talking more so adult salmon, but when you talk about smolts, the harbor seals go right up the rivers and they eat them by the mouthful. They take them out by the thousands. So this really goes more towards adult fish going back up towards the river.
That's not true. It doesn't have to. It just depends on where the haul out is and what the behavior they have.
My area, there's lots of areas, but they'll just go right up the river. That's the whole issue.
So this group, I would say, tell me if I'm characterizing appropriately, I hear strong support for expedited research in science and understand the distinction between the science that's going on in the Columbia, the science that needed for Puget Sound, and outer research that needed and outer coast. So you need to do that, right? Check that.
Yeah, but in this particular case, I would recommend funding some pilots to see if it works.
Right.
Actually, an experiment, not.
So I'm just wrapping up the whole thing. So back to that first recommendation, yes to that. I think beyond that, there's some sort of moral, philosophical, or just practical questions about whether this works for us to intervene like this. And I think the discussion back and forth was that question at the 30,000 foot level, and then some very specific discussions about what you could do in very specific places, and would that actually make a difference, and how do we think about that from a societal standpoint. I wouldn't say there's consensus in this group exactly around that. And then below that, I would say there was some both support for specific things like doing pilots here to learn and grow from that, and then some questions about why were some of the other things specific in here and not other places like Columbia River or some other places, or like the different things that were in the Caspian Turn and the thing. So if we're going to move this one forward, we need to have a way that understanding is more broad-based, a way that we deal with the broader question of predation as a technique in the first place, and how do we get enough
will we get consensus on that, and then the actions. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
just for clarity then, as far as the sequencing of how you all want to see this information, we talked about what's going to be in 2017 and what you guys are all going to talk about in 2018. From what Mark said, a lot of those things that you express support for are things that would go into this report, but it sounds like there might be a greater need to continue to talk about this issue next year. Is that a good assumption? Predation.
In general,
Yes.
yeah.
We're
Okay,
all interested
we have
in that
been got the
research.
hook for a few minutes here, so thank you guys. Very good, very different discussion from the